What crazy stuff happened in the year 2001 that got overshadowed by the Twin Towers? The Taliban blew up the Buddhas of Bamiyan in March of 2001. They were a pair of huge Buddha statues in what is now Afghanistan, built sometime around 600 CE. They were 38 meters and 55 meters tall and carved out of a cliff face, I think. On February 2001, FBI agent Robert Hansen was arrested for selling classified info to Soviet and Russian intelligence agencies. He'd been conducting this espionage since 1979. I feel like it was big news for like a month, then died down once he was thrown in federal supermax prison. I always sort of linked the two, his arrest and September 11th, since they happened the same year. FBI knew someone was leaking information to the Russians but couldn't figure out who. For months, they followed the wrong guy because they found that guy's jogging map and thought it was a drop map of location hits for information to the Russians. Brian Kelly was given a polygraph and passed. But instead of saying he's innocent, authorities felt he was just too good at beating the lie detector tests. They later grilled Kelly on other tests for months. Hansen learned of that investigation and started pushing fake info on that guy to keep investigators preoccupied. Meanwhile, his wife discovered he was doing this stuff and approached him telling him to stop. A phone message to a sting setup was the only thing that finally led to Hansen, and even then, only because one guy weeks later could finally recognize whose voice was on the recording. A hang glider accidentally crashed into the Statue of Liberty. Out of all of the things listed, this is the only one this triggered a faint memory of it happening low. I was visiting the CNN Center in Atlanta with my now husband when that happened. I remember seeing the guy dangling from the statue's crown. Parenthetically, I met my husband for the first time in person 3 weeks before 9/11. We'd been email friends for 2 years by that point. This year we celebrate our 20th anniversary. Hainan Island incident in April 2001. A Chinese jet clipped a U.S. aircraft off the coast of China. The jet crashed in the sea, and the U.S. aircraft landed in China. First major geopolitical mess of George Bush's presidency. Gave the world a somewhat major incident. I got briefly concerned as a teenager. Not any U.S. aircraft, a military signals intelligence plane. The Chinese completely stripped the plane and didn't even try to hide it. All the U.S. recovered was the airframe. Have friends of friends that were on that P-3. Once they stabilized the aircraft after the collision, the aircrew stripped anything they could and tossed it into the sea. There are protocols in place to destroy ComSec and other sensitive materials, and the aircraft would be zeroized as well. Of course, they still had limited time since it was an emergency and they had to get on the ground quick. I've read the report on that. The crew did a crappy job of destroying equipment due to a lack of training and communication. A lot of stuff remained intact and was captured by China. A huge investigation revealed that the McDonald's monopoly campaign was frauded since 1989 and had almost no legitimate winners. One guy was giving winning pieces to friends and family, and later the mafia. When this broke, it was mere weeks before 9/11, so it got quickly overshadowed. Edit, double checking my facts, it went to trial on September 10th. Wild. When President Bill Clinton left the office, he was interviewed in Australia and was asked a question about international terrorism. His response: "I'm just saying, you know, if I were Osama bin Laden, he's a very smart guy, I've spent a lot of time thinking about him, and I nearly got him once, I nearly got him. And I could have killed him, but I would have to destroy a little town called Kandahar in Afghanistan and kill 300 innocent women and children, and then I would have been no better than him. And so I didn't do it. This interview happened on September 10, 2001. Some important context to add to this quote is that US intelligence indicates that he had left that location by that point in time, but still, this is a really big what-ifs from history. Congressman Gary Condit having an affair with 24-year-old intern, Chandra Levy, who went missing and was later found murdered. I came here to say this. So I lived in the DC metro area where she disappeared and where her body was later found, and it was a dark time to be a kid in the area. The dead body of Chandra Levy found in Rock Creek Park in 2002, and then the DC sniper attacks later in 2002. For anyone who wasn't following the case at the time, Chandra was having an affair with a married congressman named Gary Condit at the time she vanished. Even though it was just a coincidence and she was almost certainly killed by some random guy who had attacked other women in that park, it totally ended Condit's career. I actually learned what a condom was because of jokes and puns about Condit. In 2009, another man was convicted of murdering Levy, So Condit didn't do it. What sunk Condit's career was that in '98 he was one of the Democrats heavily admonishing Clinton for Lewinsky, and 3 years later his own affair partner was outed and murdered. So him being a hypocrite about the sanctity of marriage and being a murder suspect did in his political career. American Airlines Flight 587. An Airbus A300 crashed in Queens, New York, 2 months after 9/11. It was the second deadliest aviation accident in U.S. history, and not well remembered. George W. Bush issued an executive order banning federal funding for research on any new embryonic stem cell lines going forward. He interrupted evening TV and did a live address to the nation from the Oval Office to announce it. This was on August 10th. His next address to the nation was on September 11th. Right before the terrorist attacks, there was a massive shorting of airline stocks, and when the stocks hit bottom on September 12th, someone made a fortune. Definitely not suspicious at all. Probably Saudi royals. I lived where the anthrax hit in 2001, just days after September 11th. They had to close down our post office and for weeks there was no mail, then finally bills came radiated and in plastic bags. You couldn't open any of the mail, it was just stuck together. And this was back in the days before you could pay bills online. The anthrax attacks in DC Sniper don't get talked about enough. They were, or at least felt like, part of 9/11 at the time and were a major contributing factor to the climate in the country that led to the approval of the next decade plus of the global war on terrorism. Edit, and the shoe bomber. System of a Down's Toxicity was released on Sept 4th. Slayer's God Hates Us All released on Sept 11th. George Carlin records an album on Sept 10th called I Kinda Like It When a Load of People Die. In the set's 10-minute closer, Uncle Dave, Carlin explains why he likes big, fatal disasters with lots of dead people, asking, "You know what's the best thing I can hear on television?" We interrupt this program. "You know the worst thing I can hear? No one was hurt. I'm always rooting for a really high death toll. That's why I like natural disasters." An earlier joke in the set includes reference to Osama bin Laden and an exploding airplane. Needless to say, the album was shelved until about 2016. I Was Working at a Music Store and Dream Theater released a live album on September 11th called Live Scenes from New York, and the original album cover featured an illustration of the World Trade Center on fire. We were asked to pull it the next day, and they re-released it with a new cover a bit later, but apparently if you went to a store and bought one it's somewhat of a collector's item, by which I mean lists on eBay for about $75 for a then $18 CD. Air Transat Flight 236. Plane from Toronto to Lisbon ran out of fuel in the middle of the Atlantic and glided 75 miles to an airport in the Azores and safely landed. Longest glide of a passenger airliner. Happened 3 weeks before 9/11. The UFO disclosure event at the National Press Club in the summer 2001 brought together a large number of credible witnesses from various government and military positions to give statements. It was largely ignored and ridiculed. I don't think people realize how massive the disclosure project was and still is. We're only now figuring out that those high-profile whistleblowers were actually telling the truth, since only recently has the Pentagon officially admitted that UFOs fly over restricted airspace and that they're not drones but rather metallic spheres or objects that defy our understanding of physics. We're not alone on this planet and the world is too occupied to even notice. Nepalese Royal Massacre. June 1, 2001. 9 members of the royal family were killed, including the king. It is thought that the crown prince, who died 3 days later after being in a coma and being crowned the new king, was responsible. And people say the plot of Hamlet is over the top. The crown prince opened fire at an event, killing damn everyone in line for royal succession. Then he shot himself in the head. There was no attempt to become the king, though he was made king while in a coma. He just killed everyone else in line. The front page story in a lot of papers on the morning of September 11th was about a Houston mom who drowned her 5 children in a bathtub. Andrea Kennedy Yates, right? When she got married, her husband told her they would have as many children as God would allow and bought them a 4-bedroom house. But then when she got pregnant, he changed jobs and moved them into a 2-bedroom trailer. And then after the second was born, he squeezed them into an old RV to save money. She offered to get a job and he refused because God called her to be a mom. After the third and fourth one, she had nervous breakdowns and tried to end her life. She was put on Haldol and did much better. Husband even got a better job and moved them into a small house. Her psychiatrist warned her husband to get a vasectomy because if Andrea got pregnant again she would probably find some way to end her life. Husband refused based on religious grounds. Weeks later she got pregnant again. Psychiatrist urged her to abort. In response, husband tells psychiatrist they will no longer be returning to therapy. Her husband made her stop taking her medicine because it might hurt the baby. That combined with pregnancy hormones plus her father dying led her to start hearing the voice of God telling her that if she wanted to die, her husband wouldn't know how to raise the children. Apparently he never helped with their care, so it would be merciful to end their lives first. She filled up the tub planning to drown them, but her husband came home in time, and she was hospitalized. However, a few days alone with the kids made him demand her release. He was warned that she needed to be watched around the clock, but he left for work the next day anyway, calling for his mom to come watch his wife. Edit. No. He had the idea of purposefully leaving her alone for an hour every day to make her stronger. So he told his mom to come an hour after he left. I forgot about that part. In that hour Andrea drowned all 5 children. Also, the doctors had told them that Andrea should never be alone with the children, but her husband left her alone that morning to go to work. Her mother, I think it was her mother, was supposed to be coming over but was running late at something and husband just said fuck it, what do the doctors know? And took off. This was the result. He deserved prison time for the abuse he heaped on that woman. The movie Zoolander flopped, relatively speaking, at the box office because it came out right after September 11th. Donnie Darko also came out shortly after 9/11 and revolves around a plane engine crashing into the main character's house. Probably didn't fare too well at the box office as a result. There were 3 separate shark attacks in the USA that summer, leading Time magazine to dub it the Summer of the Shark. There was a ton of news coverage about it. In 2001, the Human Genome Project was completed, mapping the entire human DNA sequence. This groundbreaking achievement, promising to revolutionize medicine, was largely overshadowed by the tragic events of 9/11. I was just talking about this today at work with a colleague. I believe that project traced a significant portion of the current human population back to an indigenous population in South Africa when the human genome went through a massive bottleneck that wiped out a majority of the various other humans that were around at the time. The only people who were not wiped were those from this South African tribe that has been in that same area as far back as human history can be traced. From there, the tribe members started migrating northward and eventually went on to repopulate the rest of the earth. I remember watching a Natural Geographic documentary about it several years ago, but the details are fuzzy at best from my memory. Timothy McVeigh was executed on June 11 for the Oklahoma City domestic terrorist bombing. I believe it was the first federal prison execution in several decades. The Boston Globe had all the information ready to release uncovering the rampant pedo cases being covered up by the Catholic Church. After 9/11, they decided to wait to release it. For those that haven't seen it, Spotlight is absolutely a must-watch on this entire investigation, and even covers exactly this instance in the movie. Fantastic movie, incredible cast. The Sacramento shooter killed a number of people in an age where mass shootings weren't daily in the USA. Shot several employees at his place of work on September 9, 2001, was the subject of a manhunt and ended up in a shootout and took his own life. He made a video suicide tape where he said, "I've taken 4 victims, this should be good enough to last about a week on the news. It's time to feed the news media." His actions were the front page news of morning papers on September 11th. The 2001 Aspen plane crash. It was overshadowed by 9/11 for pretty obvious reasons, but it's still a crazy story. A bunch of people, mostly young people in their low 20s who worked in entertainment, were on their way to Aspen for a birthday weekend to go skiing. An older colleague decided to host the trip, chartering a private jet to get them there. At some point, the pilots informed him that they weren't going to make Aspen's strict landing curfew, and also, there was a massive snowstorm. It was going to be both illegal, and far too dangerous for them to land in Aspen, and they were going to have to divert the plane. He threw a giant fit. He told them, "No, you have to land in Aspen. I spent a lot of money to have a dinner party in Aspen. You're gonna get us there, snowstorm and FAA restrictions be damned." While preparing to attempt landing, the charter customer then went into the cockpit, presumably to intimidate the pilots into meeting his demands. The pilots didn't want to upset him, so they attempted a landing, even lying to the air traffic controller about having visibility of the runway. So they attempted a blind landing. The plane was around 300 to 500 feet from the ground when the pilot realized he fucked up, The runway was actually in the other direction from where he was headed. So he quickly banked the plane into the other direction, presumably to fix the landing, or was probably making a last-ditch attempt to abort the landing altogether. As he did this, the plane's wing slammed into a hillside, and everyone went cartwheeling into their death. Bodies still strapped to their seats were ejected, and then scattered onto a nearby road. They didn't crash due to terrorism, hijacking, or a mechanical failure. They crashed because the customer is always right. I saw a Dateline episode about a woman from upstate NY who went missing on September 11th, and there wasn't enough manpower to investigate because of it. This was from my neck of the woods. The scumbag husband was heavily suspected of doing it by the rest of the family, so while they were all gathered around waiting for anything to come from the police, a family member tried to get a reaction out of him by lying and telling him they, the police, found the body. He very coldly replied that they'd never find the body. This motherfucker 100 trillion% killed her. Sept 7, 2001 US government announces they won't break up Microsoft as a monopoly. Forgotten in Rumsfeld's speech about the missing funds, the clearest and most important transformation is from a bipolar Cold War world where threats were visible and predictable, to one in which they arise from multiple sources, most of which are difficult to anticipate, and many of which are impossible even to know today. Also, the purpose of the speech was to cut military spending and shift some military control of logistics and base infrastructure to the private sector. Tui Trang, Yellow Power Ranger from MMPR, passed away in a car accident September 3, 2001. I was a big MMPR fan and I don't remember hearing about that. By a very large margin, what would have been the biggest story of the year would have been the Enron scandal, the largest corporate bankruptcy in world history, which was built upon a mountain of fraud so large it still beggars the imagination, which severely damaged or destroyed the retirement savings of millions of people, and with political aspects that implicated the president, federal regulators, as well as the Republican Party in California. The day before, so September 10th, $2.3 trillion was announced by the Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld as unaccounted for. They had trouble tracking the spending of tax money. Then September 11th happened and it got buried along with 5,000 New Yorkers. $2.3 trillion over the previous 10 years. It didn't vanish all at once. I think that's the part that always gets left out of the story. The Genoa G8 Summit protest, 19 to July 22, 2001. It was a dramatic protest, drawing an estimated 200,000 demonstrators. Dozens were hospitalized following clashes with police and night raids by security forces on two schools housing activists and independent journalists. Amnesty International defined the raid as the most serious human rights suspension in Europe since 1945, as protesters were tortured and massacred by the Italian police. August 2001, Robert Courtney was arrested. He was a pharmacist who decided to dilute cancer meds for personal profit. They couldn't officially label him a serial killer since the victims had cancer, but he diluted prescriptions for 4,200 patients. The disappearance of Sneha Philip. Officially, she's listed as a victim of September 11th, but opinions vary as to what really happened. She had rushed to the scene and was killed while trying to help victims. She was a doctor. She was in the World Trade Center on unrelated business, possibly having breakfast at the windows on the World Restaurant, when the attacks occurred. She was murdered nearby in an incident unrelated to the terrorist attacks, and any evidence of the crime, as well as her remains, was lost in the rubble and by diversion of law enforcement resources. She chose to use the confusion of the day to disappear and start a new life elsewhere. She was known to be having difficulties in both her personal and her professional life. In summer of 2001, Fox aired a documentary-styled reality show called Murder in Small Town X. The finale aired just a week before 9/11. The winner of the first and only season was a firefighter, and he was one of the first responders at the World Trade Center that was killed. His body wouldn't be discovered until 2 months later. With so much else that happened on September 11th, one of the victims being a reality TV star was surprisingly rarely brought up. In May 2000, Giuliani announced in a press conference that he was leaving his second wife. His wife reported she learned he was leaving her during that press conference. People started wondering if he had dumped his first wife in a similar fashion. They found out his first wife was someone he had grown up knowing was his cousin. He was an absolute joke until September 11th, which he rode all the way to becoming a serious presidential candidate in 2008. It wasn't until Trump's re-election campaign that we all started to remember how much of an absolute buffoon he was. I recall the dot-com bust being in full swing. Lots of companies going under and layoffs. As I recall, the market swore up and down that things were fine, but by summer 2001 the writing was definitely on the wall. The real driving of the knife that made it a big recession instead of a market hiccup was 9/11 and then Enron's bankruptcy announcement on September 12. One of the bigger reasons Bush pushed for Iraq was to attempt to use a wartime stimulus to bolster the economy before the election. But this is largely forgotten about because of the many larger reasons the Bush administration benefited from invading Iraq. The economy was not an afterthought in the decision, but it was just kind of a known part of the deal. Ana Belén Montes, one of the most damaging spies in American history, got arrested about 2 weeks after 9/11. Exit, a bit more info. She was a DIA higher-up who was passing info to Cuba and had been for over a decade, I think. Operation Bluebird tells the story, and she's also an example of humans defaulting to truth in Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers. The death of NASCAR's most popular driver at the time, Dale Earnhardt, was killed while racing at Daytona. I'm not a big NASCAR guy, but he was the Michael Jordan of that sport, and he was and still is an icon to a decent amount of Americans. Cantor Fitzgerald Brokerage was under investigation of prolific sexual misconduct and harassment, if I recall correctly. Then the plane practically wiped them out. Their offices were on floors 101 to 105 of the North Tower. 100% of their employees that were at work that day died. 658 people. My cousin was one of them, and his parents soon followed, probably due to the extreme grief they experienced afterwards. They had immigrated, worked their butts off at restaurants, and he was finally living the successful American dream. That day was a long walk back into Queens and so many awful phone calls afterwards. Hated hearing my father translate what had happened and breaking the news to everyone else in the family.